Welcome to our briefing on the Alabama Statehouse-to-Prison Pipeline report. Before we get started today and dive into the content, I'm going to pass it to our interpreters so that they can explain how to use interpretation services.
Buenas tardes a todos. Los organizadores de este evento tienen la firme determinación de facilitar la comunicación bilingüe en la reunión de hoy. Mi nombre es Mojde, mi cointérprete es Ron, y estamos representando a la Cooperativa de Justicia del Lenguaje Tilde. Estaremos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea inglés-español, español-inglés. Good afternoon, everybody. The organizers of this event are firmly committed to facilitating bilingual communication in today's meeting. My name is Mojde. My co-interpreter today is Ron, and we represent the Tilde Language Justice Cooperative. We'll be providing English-Spanish and Spanish-English simultaneous interpretation. Si usted se unió a la reunión usando su teléfono, por favor asegúrese de entrar con el app de Zoom para poder acceder a la función de interpretación. Esta función no está disponible en los Chromebook. If you joined on your phone, please join on the Zoom app so that you can access the interpretation function. And please note that this function is not available on Chromebook. Si usted no es bilingüe español-inglés, puede seleccionar su canal de idioma siguiendo las instrucciones en la pantalla, haciendo clic abajo a la derecha en su pantalla de Zoom, en el globito si usa una computadora o en los tres puntitos si está conectado por teléfono. Seleccione interpretación, luego español y luego picarle en Done o finalizar. If you're not bilingual Spanish-English, you can select your language channel by going to the bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. Click on the globe if you're using a computer or the three dots if you're connected by phone. Select interpretation, then English, and then click Done at the end. If anybody speaks in Spanish, you will only be able to hear the interpretation in English if you choose this option. Algunas pautas para crear un espacio multilingüe. A few guidelines for creating multilingual spaces. Por favor, no hablen muy rápido. Esto pasa especialmente cuando uno esté leyendo una presentación o emocionada, nerviosa o al tener poco tiempo. Y si no están hablando, por favor, pongan su audio en silencio. Please don't speak fast. This happens especially when reading a presentation or excited, nervous, or running out of time. And if you're not speaking, please mute yourself. Por último, les vamos a recordar que por favor hablen una persona a la vez y en un idioma por oración. Lastly, we remind you to please speak one person at a time and with one language per sentence. Estos espacios se crean con el apoyo de todos. Por favor, comunique cualquier problema por la ventana de chat o habilitando su micrófono. Gracias por crear este espacio multilingüe. We create these spaces with everyone's support, so please communicate any issues by chat or turning on your volume. Thank you for creating this multilingual space.
Thank you all so much. And again, if you have any needs around interpretation, you can also ask in the chat for assistance if there's a problem. But thank you for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. So before we jump right in, a couple of things y'all should know is at the very end of this presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions and get them answered. However, throughout the entire presentation today, you can use the Q&A function to submit your questions as we move along, so that way you don't forget them, but they will be answered at the very end of the presentation. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists today, our folks who are going to be leading this briefing. So our policy director, Dillon Nettles, and our investigative reporter, Beth Shelburne. I will go ahead and have them answer this question as they introduce themselves and greet y'all, but could you all start off with just sharing what is your vision of smart justice?
Sure, I'm happy to, Steph. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Dillon Nettles. I'm the policy director here at the ACLU of Alabama, and I use he, him pronouns. And I think that I would consider smart justice to be about what moves us and advances us towards a world where people feel safe, where we don't rely on criminal punishment in order for that to be the case, and people are invested in what really creates safe communities, which is, investments in the things that we need, our material needs, education, healthcare, housing, all of those things.
Thanks, Dillon. Hi, everybody. My name is Beth Shelburne. I'm investigative reporter with ACLU of Alabama. My pronouns are she, her. And glad that Stef asked us to come up with our own definition of smart justice, because it's the work that we do, but we don't often take the time to really clearly define what it is that means when we're in the trenches doing the work. So I wrote mine, and I'd like to read it. My definition of smart justice is fair and equitable, not motivated by profit, not motivated by politics, where all sides receive equal resources. Smart justice addresses harm with restorative processes. It addresses addiction and mental illness with diagnosis and treatment. And it creates settings of confinement to be used only when absolutely necessary for the sole purposes of rehabilitation and education, with a set goal, date, and support for re-entry into society.
Thank y'all both so much for sharing those visions. And it is with that vision and what you laid out for us that y'all are gonna present this report to us. And it's also how this report came to be, right? With these values that you all just shared. So we can go ahead into the next slide. So today's briefing is going to be broken up into two major parts, just to give you all a little preview, a little taste of what's to come. Dillon is going to be taking on this first part of the briefing, really giving y'all the major overview of the report, giving y'all also some key takeaways, and also leaving y'all with some legislative trends and what we saw in the last legislative session. When we get to Beth's part, Beth will be breaking down more specifically the current prison conditions that we're experiencing, and also just the outcomes of what Dillon lays out. So when Dillon lays out what has happened in the legislature, Beth will show you how that has manifested directly inside of our current prison crisis. So just to give you all a sense of these two parts, but I'm gonna go ahead and pass it off to you, Dillon.
Thank you, Stef. So you really just kicked it off at the perfect point, just by, describing how this report was motivated. Alabama's prisons have been in a perpetual state of violence, mismanagement, and overcrowding for years. And when we set out to write this report, we wanted to make it clear to the public that the Alabama Legislature has continued to sidestep the responsibility in addressing it. So the ACLU of Alabama's policy and advocacy team began compiling this report just near the end of the 2021 regular session. And that was after we saw yet another legislative session pass without a robust response to what's been a looming crisis. So it only takes a brief walk down memory lane to remember that it was actually in the 2019 regular session, it was in April of 2019, that the U.S. Department of Justice issued a report stating that Alabama had and was continuing to violate the Eighth Amendment rights of individuals incarcerated in its men's prisons. After Governor Ivey convened a criminal justice reform study group that did not include a single person who had been incarcerated or directly works with formerly incarcerated individuals, and that study group did meet for several months, we remained hopeful despite the shortcomings that some serious effort will be put forth in a special session or in the 2020 regular session to take up some positive recommendations from that study group regarding sentencing and reentry and rehabilitation, which are also things that Beth got at in her opening as well. Needless to say, no one expected the 2020 regular session to be abbreviated, and as COVID-19 impacted the state, it obviously seemed that the hope for reform might be lost for the year. Still, in June of 2020, the DOJ released yet another concerning report detailing the excessive force and violence at the hands of Alabama Department of Corrections staff, which are responsible for the protection and care of incarcerated people. The reporters in Alabama media also, frankly, were publishing stories detailing the horrific incidents of violence and drug overdoses and negligence. And yet these reports were met with no urgency from our state lawmakers or the governor. Finally, it was in December of 2020 that the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit, which Beth will be talking more about later. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So as the 2021 regular session was nearing a close, we saw yet another session pass without the legislature prioritizing these urgent areas of concern for people who are in the custody of Alabama Department of Corrections. So not only were the efforts to mitigate the crisis minimal in the session, but we actually began to assess what was a consistent flow of legislation that actually would only make it worse. We felt it was important to speak more about this and provide the public with an analysis of what we deem pipeline bills. These bills fit the criteria which you can see on your screen. One, they created or enhanced a criminal penalty. Two, they created or enhanced a civil penalty. Three, they increased funding for policing and or corrections. Four, they expanded the scale, scope, and power of policing and or corrections. And five, they expanded the reach of jails, prisons, and surveillance in the everyday lives of Alabamians. And I think it's important to note here that while this report is titled, of course, the Statehouse-to-Prison Report, Alabama's jails, I'm talking our county and even our local city jails, are also in a state of overcrowding and even violence. And so while we focus a lot on the Alabama Department of Corrections in this report, and bills that we feel certainly contribute to what's a state of disaster in those facilities, this is not untrue of our county jails and city jails. And many of those facilities also hold people that may be still actually in the custody of the Department of Corrections, although they may be housed in a more localized facility. And so I think it is really important that we capture here that this is a widespread problem in Alabama that really unfortunately carries over from facility to facility, which we often deem as correctional. And that's simply not the case, or I think an accurate characterism of what role these facilities are serving. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, considered alone, many of these quote unquote pipeline bills may sound innocuous, right? Individually, few add significantly to the prison population. But together, year after year, the lawmaking practice of ceaselessly inventing a new crime and longer sentence causes the tide of imprisonment to rise. This also is expanding what is called the carceral state, a term which has been used broadly in prison movements, but for the purposes of this report, we drew from the work of Dr. Ruby Tipia at the University of Michigan, who states, and I quote, "The carceral state encompasses the informal institutions and operations and economies of the criminal justice system proper, but it also encompasses logics, ideologies, practices, and structures that invest in tangible and sometimes intangible ways and punitive orientations to difference, to poverty, to struggles, to social justice, and to the crossers of constructed borders of all kinds." So our goal with this report really was to demonstrate to legislators, elected officials, stakeholders, Alabamians, and all interested parties that the primary reason Alabama is facing a crisis in its prisons, a lawsuit from the US Department of Justice, and a continuous cycle of Alabamians who have been destabilized, lost their housing, employment, and even voting rights, is because the legislature continues to ignore the root causes of crime and violence. And what, so many people are seeking when they talk about public safety and the safety that they not only desire, but frankly deserve in their communities, we don't see nearly enough pieces of legislation that are actually introduced that are consistent with those calls from communities that I know lawmakers are consistently hearing and seeking some real solutions to address. Oftentimes they're falling back on, again, these pipeline bills, which are, I think to Dr. Tipia's definition, right, representative of people who are very much invested in carceral policies and the carceral state, which seems to be ever expanding in Alabama. We also wanted to underscore with this report that prison construction will not address the root causes of crime. And that is a topic that I think many people are aware is very much on the table and a part of a lot of conversations in Alabama about how we move forward in the wake of the Department of Justice lawsuit. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So I want to just highlight some key takeaways from the report. From February of 2021, when the 2021 regular session started, to May 2021, when it concluded, 1,053 pieces of legislation were introduced in the regular session. Of those, 139 bills are what we consider pipeline bills. And to get a bit more into it, 90 of those were in the House. That of the House was about 13, almost 14% of the House bills. And 25 of those bills in the pipeline, which actually made up almost 7% of the Senate bills this session, contained mass incarceration and carceral policies. Now, only 52 of those bills ultimately were signed into law, but I do want to just you to imagine for a moment what it would look like if over 20% of the legislation filed in this most recent session focused on mitigating the crisis in Alabama's prisons. What if over 20% of the bills that were filed in the most recent session addressed actual poverty, which is a huge driver of crime and destabilization of people who commit crime? What if 20% of those bills were addressing housing or education or healthcare, which again are all indicators of what may drive people to have to find themselves committing crimes for their livelihood or because of other circumstances, which frankly may have been beyond their control. I know that Beth will share more about a lot of the stories that she's collected and the people she's spoken with over the years of her reporting, but I think that this is a really interesting indicator and one of the most significant takeaways from this report of how deeply Alabama is going in the wrong direction when it comes to addressing this. And we can go on to the next slide, which just gives us another look at this. It gives us a breakdown of the House and the Senate bills. And again, you can see that in the House, we saw more bills with 90 pipeline bills that were filed and 27 in the Senate. And I also want to note that it is important that while a majority of these bills were Republican sponsored, by no means were they all. And this is an issue that really cuts across partisan politics. Both parties are contributing to the pipeline. And I really think that that is important for our audience today to understand, because we will be talking about some calls to action before we leave here, but also this report was by no means intended to focus on one party or the other. What we need to be doing, and we're hoping for, is that the Alabama Legislature will think as a whole more deeply about this issue overall and what they can do to address it in a bipartisan way, and frankly, not be entrenched in partisan politics that have too long held, I think, Alabamians back from, again, the real solutions that we are all seeking. So let's go on to the next slide and talk about trends. So we, in the report, detailed a few areas or buckets in which we saw some trends of the type of pipeline bills that we identified. And we can kind of go through each of these, and I'm not going to, exhaust too much time on, every bill that fit necessarily one of these, but there were a few in the report which I want to just touch base on. So one of the trends was, of course, seeing new and enhanced penalties. That was, of course, a criteria to even be a part of the report. That was one of the criteria in which bills may have met to be in the report, I should say. So we definitely saw a number of those, and those are probably, frankly, the biggest trend across the bills that were in the pipeline. One in particular was House Bill 445, which was sponsored by Representative Alan Treadaway and House District 51. And this was introduced with the aim to establish two new criminal penalties, the crime of aggravated riot and unlawful traffic interference. Of course, I don't think I need to tell anyone as the ACLU that this is a concern for us. We know that not only was Representative Treadaway's district, but many districts across the state saw a massive response to last summer's uprisings in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's deaths. And we certainly are concerned about efforts like this to criminalize people's exercise of their First Amendment rights and expression. By and large, what we saw across the state of Alabama were peaceful protests that did not result in any violence or injury, and introducing new criminal penalties to quell expression and First Amendment is something that not only is not a meaningful way of actually, encouraging people to exercise the First Amendment right, but it also adds yet another criminal penalty, which will sanction people with the discretion of law enforcement to determine if they were in violation of, let's be honest, activity that is by and large not popular among law enforcement. So I do just want to underscore that is yet another representation of these type of penalties that continue to be added. Let's talk about also criminalizing trans healthcare, which was an issue that the ACLU of Alabama was at the forefront of, along with many of our partners all across the state. We saw the introduction of HB1 and an SB 10 by Representative Wes Allen and Senator Shay Shelnut. These bills would criminalize Alabama's physicians providing gender-affirming care to trans youth, which was, again, a core issue for the ACLU, but also something that we saw a massive response from across the state. So many families who are going to be directly impacted by this, but also physicians who are practicing right now in Alabama, providing care to children in Alabama could see an actual felony penalty if these bills were passed into law. Fortunately, we did not see HB1 or SB 10 go on to be passed, but we do know that these attacks will be coming back and returning and are unfortunately a part of a wave of anti-trans legislation that has swept the country over the course of the last 2 years. And finally, another trend which we identified was criminalizing abortion access. This is yet again not an issue that we were unfamiliar with at the ACLU. We oftentimes, unfortunately, see efforts to criminalize abortion access, and again, they go after physicians, our care providers, in order to do so by threatening them with prosecution under a criminal penalty, a felony charge typically. And so we, again, continue to see these type of new penalties being created in an effort to basically dictate how the legislature feels people should exercise their civil liberties. And these are something that the ACLU will continue to track and to be on the defense of, because of course, our core and our mission is to safeguard these civil liberties. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So we did also do some tracking of positive bills, and really without, we'll have a moment to talk about each of them and what they mean. But one of the things that I just wanted to name off the top is that one of the motivations or one of the reasonings, I should say, that we really identified these as actually positive bills is because we think that they represent or get at the type of legislation that, if we saw more of, could really make meaningful improvements in our prison system. So things like providing second chances to people who are currently incarcerated, restoring more judicial discretion for look back at cases and resentencing for people who are currently incarcerated, and more transparency around what's taking place in the Alabama Department of Corrections, which has been something that a lot of people have struggled with, including the media, over the course of this last several years. So let's take a look at some of those positive bills more closely. So House Bill 24, which was actually sponsored by House Judiciary Chair Jim Hill. This was a bill that would provide an opportunity for resentencing for people with nonviolent convictions. And while we certainly feel that we have to go much broader than nonviolent convictions in order to really meaningfully address this overcrowding that's taking place in Alabama's prisons, this does represent, I think, a step forward in a positive direction. And again, I think, a lot of people who are probably listening to this who are familiar with Representative Hill are very much familiar with, his background as a judge. He believes in the judicial process. And I think that him bringing a bill this session, which would have really taken, again, a positive step in the right direction for providing people who are currently incarcerated with an opportunity for resentencing, it does underscore that there's an opportunity for both sides of the aisle to come together and to find solutions that they think will begin to move the needle. And so this was encouraging, and it did pass the House with a vote of 63-33. And so obviously that represents bipartisan buy-in. After passing the House, the Senate Judiciary Committee also passed the bill with an amendment. And so it came very close to final passage. And I do hope that we'll see HB 24. It will be a different bill number, but I hope we'll see this bill return next year. Let's go on to the next one. House Bill 107. This was a repeal of the Alabama Habitual Felony Offender Act. This was a bill that you all probably heard the ACLU talking a lot about over the course of this last session because it was a lead priority for us. For those of you who may just be unfamiliar, the Habitual Felony Offender Act is essentially Alabama's 3 strikes law. And it has been one of the harshest and most draconian sentencing laws on the books in the country for several decades, and it continues to contribute to the widespread sentencing disparity that we do see in Alabama's prisons. Beth is going to talk more about that around racial lines as well later, but there's, I don't think, any surprise to folks that overwhelmingly we see a disparity in incarceration among Black and Brown people, and among that we also are seeing these very harsh and extreme sentences being therefore applied mostly to Black and Brown individuals. HB 107 would have provided a judicial discretion again for judges to take a second look at those cases upon people's application who are currently incarcerated, and would, essentially repeal what this law from the books, meaning that we would then have a path forward for people who are currently sentenced to be able to, or currently sentenced under this law to be able to apply for resentencing and hopefully see a reduced sentence or possibly become parole eligible where they may have an opportunity, but parole is a whole nother issue that we'll also be getting at shortly here. Let's go on to the next. House Bill 106. Now, this is a bill that did reach final passage in really, I believe, the final hours of this legislative session, but of course, it doesn't matter when it happened. We were really excited that it did. This bill would have required the Alabama Department of Corrections to provide quarterly reports to the Joint Legislative Prison Oversight Committee. Believe it or not, there is one. And this report would detail the number and manner of deaths of incarcerated individuals and incidents of sexual violence. We'd also get additional data on staffing, which has been a serious issue as well in Alabama's DOC facilities, total population, participation in training and rehabilitation programs, and a number of other things that have really not been easily accessible or available, not only to the public, but even to members of the legislature. This getting passed is going to really be important going forward for the type of conversations and the nature of what we can address in Alabama's, in the future of reform of Alabama's prisons. And let's go on to the next. And I think at this point, I get to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Beth Shelburne.
Yeah, right before you jump in, Beth, I just wanted to remind folks that you can use the Q&A element to ask some questions, especially because Dillon shared so much that was important and critical. And if you want to ask deeper questions, that's an opportunity. But just to adjust our focus and move into Beth's piece. At the top of your presentation, Dillon, you talked about the ways that our legislative body is not pushing for policy that addresses our actual public safety needs. And something that feels really critical is like, not only is it not addressing public safety needs, it's sort of exacerbating the problem. But it's making public safety needs even harder, particularly within our jails and prisons. And so as we shift over to hear from Beth, who is like the expert here, who is like working with families and listening to stories and always trying to like report the honest truth. Keep that in mind, is that our legislative body has a responsibility to address public safety needs, but oftentimes they're not, based off of the data that Dillon just shared. So I will pass it over to you, Beth, now, but don't forget about the Q&A aspect, but thank you.
Thank you, Stef, and thanks, Dillon. And just a little note on that last bill that Dillon reviewed, HB 106, the ADOC oversight bill. I just checked with Representative England, Chris England, who was the sponsor of that bill, and asked him, when does that go into effect? And he told me September 1st. And so once it goes into effect, that means that the Department of Corrections has to submit this data to the Prison Oversight Committee quarterly. And it means that there will be one public meeting per year that will allow for public input. So stay tuned to ACLU of Alabama, because we will certainly be there to support families and directly impacted people that want to attend that meeting, want to amplify the issues that they're dealing with. You know, we will help facilitate that. So if we could, Jasmine, I think, is controlling the slides. Thanks. This is the first slide that I'll show, and it shows the real glaring racial disparity that Dillon mentioned in our prison system. And I think it's important, as we talk about kind of Alabama's prison crisis, to start with the racial disparity, because it's really the backdrop of everything that goes on in our criminal punishment system. And it's an acute and ongoing issue in Alabama. We know that race is intertwined in all of our criminal punishment system, not just Alabama, but all over the country. We can't really have this conversation without addressing race. You know, the infrastructure and the origin story of the systems that are in place are rooted in racism and racial oppression, slavery, profiteering off of people of color. And many of these forces are still at work today. And the policies and practices that are going on in policing, certainly an implicit bias that can happen to anyone. So we wanted to show you the racial disparity. And if you've ever visited any of the prisons or jails in Alabama, you see this when you walk into the facility, and it's stunning to see. As a white person walking into an incarcerated setting and seeing a sea of Black and brown people in front of me, every time I go into a prison, it really kind of takes my breath away. The disparity is real, it's ugly, it's there. And that's why we do the work that we do. So Jasmine, I think you can go to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about where the crisis is right now. As Dillon mentioned, the Department of Justice conducted an extensive investigation into the entire system and came out with its findings in April of 2019 that the system is indeed unconstitutional. It amounts to cruel and unusual punishment. This is a pretty poignant quote from the investigation and lawsuit. But how this is playing out right now, and what I'm seeing in my reporting and talking to people every day that are in the system and talking to family members of people that are in the system, we're really encountering a time of unprecedented deaths and violence inside the system. And this is a system that is working very hard to prevent transparency surrounding these deaths and these violent incidents, and to cover this information up. That's why HB 106 was necessary, because it's not just reporters like me that get shut out. Many of our lawmakers are not getting the information that is public information about this government institution, the largest law enforcement agency in our state, that's responsible for the well-being of people that are incarcerated. So I've been tracking deaths inside ADOC since 2018, mainly deaths that I and other reporters and the DOJ consider preventable. So these are deaths due to homicide, suicide, drug-related deaths like overdoses, but not necessarily overdoses. There's other ways people are dying directly connected to drug use and substance use inside the system. So everything outside of natural deaths, I've been tracking those deaths based on intelligence that I get from the facilities and sometimes from information that's confirmed by ADOC. This year, this calendar year, 2021, while we're in a global pandemic, while the system is essentially locked down because of COVID with limited movement, no visitation, I have seen the sharpest increase in prison deaths since I've been tracking it. We are already at 31 such deaths this calendar year, and we still have 4 months to go. The closest number that I've tracked since 2018 was in 2019. For the entire calendar year, there were 29 such deaths. So the violence has increased exponentially since the Department of Justice released its findings, which really underscores the importance of staying on the legislature to address this, because their inattention and their lack of movement is literally a matter of life and death inside these facilities. We're also seeing an uptick in drug-related deaths and overdoses. I've had a chance to examine some autopsy reports from people that have died in custody, and oftentimes the death will be classified due to certain disease, but I'll see the person tested positive for methamphetamine at the time of death. So I put those deaths in a drug-related column, even if a county coroner or a medical examiner that's doing the autopsy classifies the death as natural. But it's interesting to think about this uptick in drug-related deaths, given the pandemic and given the fact that the prisons are essentially closed. Educators are not coming in, volunteers are not coming in. I understand at some facilities, they are allowing a limited number of religious volunteers and educational volunteers in for the first time this month. But the past 18 months, no one has been coming or going except for staff. The incarcerated population has had limited movement. Even people incarcerated in minimum security facilities like work centers and work release are not reporting to work. They're confined in these settings. So everybody's really caged inside these facilities. And the only way that drugs can be coming in is either somebody tossing them over the fence, which is a security issue, or somebody bringing it inside, which would have to be staff. So I just think it's important to contextualize this because there's clearly issues of corruption within this agency that have not been fully exposed, and certainly have not been fully recognized by the agency or the Department of Justice for that matter. We've really seen a terrible impact from COVID. And Jasmine, you can go to the next screen. I think we've got where the DOC is posting data totals on its website. There's 66 people have died, and that's the number of people who have died directly from COVID. I think that the number is probably a lot higher, but the deaths might have been attributed to something else. It's important to recognize that Alabama, in the face of this pandemic, Alabama lawmakers, the leadership of ADOC, the governor of Alabama, all of them collectively took no action to reduce the prison population. They took no action to transfer people to lower security settings, or to place people on medical furlough, or to increase medical paroles. The mechanisms that are in place to alleviate the prison population, to move people that are most at risk of dying of this disease, to move people that are not a public safety threat into a more appropriate setting. We've seen other states do this in the wake of incarcerated populations facing a much higher risk of infection and death from COVID, but Alabama has essentially done nothing. The number of people on medical furlough is next to nothing, and that's a function that the Department of Corrections could facilitate, but they have not. And so during this pandemic, not only have we had all of the system actors not take any measures to reduce the prison population, we have a prison population that has no visitation, no classes or rehabilitative programs. They're not reporting to work. And people that are not used to being confined are being kept in a very confined setting. And so that has led to quite a bit of despair among the population. If you want to go to the next slide, Jasmine, this is a woman that is incarcerated in a minimum security facility. And she said to me, that the Department of Corrections was beginning to allow some people into the facility where she is, but not her family. And they have not allowed any family visitation. She has children, she has grandchildren, and she told me, I haven't seen them, now it's 17 months. So, it's a little bit of a bitter pill for the incarcerated population to see religious volunteers come in when they haven't seen their families in 18 months. And the number of people vaccinated within the prison population is about double what Alabama's vaccination rate is overall. So I think, and all of the people that I've talked to in the system think that ADOC could facilitate some limited visitation if they wanted to, open it up to vaccinated incarcerated people and their families, but they have chosen to not do that. So how did we get here into this situation, being such a terrible environment in our prison system? That's a slide on parole grants, and you can leave it there, Jasmine, because that's an integral part of the story. But just to give you a little bit of background about how we got here, Dillon mentioned our habitual felony offender law, which is considered the harshest in the nation. Really the most punitive and draconian and unfair in the nation. We enacted that law, written by, at the time, Attorney General Charlie Graddick in 1977. So Alabama was kind of on the vanguard of tough on crime legislation ahead of the federal government and other states. So it imposed life sentences and life without parole, taking discretion away from judges on a huge amount of people that were being sentenced in our courts. And now we see the impact. Over 6,000 people in our prison system are serving enhanced sentences. 3 out of 4 people serving these enhanced sentences are Black. And so right now we have sentencing guidelines that are in place, but district attorneys have the discretion of whether or not to invoke the habitual offender law if they want to, and they are still choosing to invoke it in certain cases, and that has created a real disparity, a geographic disparity. In Houston County, I think the invocation of the habitual offender law is happening at 20 times the rate of Alabama's most populous county, Jefferson County. So where you get processed through the court system matters on whether or not you're prosecuted under the Habitual Offender Act, which creates disparity. And then with the disparity that we see, 75% of the people sentenced are Black. Obviously, there's a racial disparity that's happening. So there's problems given that discretion at the prosecutor level. What we're also seeing that has been largely ignored by our lawmakers is that over half of this population serving time under our habitual offender law is over 50. So we have a largely aging prison population at high risk of COVID, at very low risk of reoffending, and no evidence that these lifelong or terminal sentences make us safer. But yet Alabama lawmakers have not done anything to address this aging population that are really just being warehoused in our prisons. So that kind of brings me to the slide that we're on right now, which is our parole crisis. And if you follow me on Twitter, then you might see me tweet about the actions of our parole board or the inactions, as it may be. Paroles have really fallen off a cliff, and this has been a reliable mechanism for keeping our prison population at a reasonable level, giving people something to strive for in the system. And it's important to note that our entire sentencing structure in Alabama is based on making people parole eligible. So it's built into our system, but yet this current parole board has essentially taken it off the table for the majority of people who are parole eligible. You can see in the right-hand bottom corner the denial rates that have gone up. And just to put that in perspective, in 2017, when Lynn Head was the director of the parole board, the denial rate was 46%. So with the political landscape changing on the parole board, the outcomes changed. So it's important to note that the prison population hasn't changed. The nature of crimes has not changed. Really, the environment inside our prisons have gotten worse, not better, which is a reason to think about increasing your parole apparatus. But what has changed is the bureaucracy and the political appointments. So this uptick in parole denials and the falling grant rates really doesn't have anything to do with people in the system. It has to do with who's in charge and the decisions that they're making. And when Governor Ivey appointed Lee Guathney, who is a career prosecutor, to chair the parole board, we saw paroles fall off a cliff. The number of hearings dropped to historic lows, and the number of parole grants fell exponentially. And it has really created widespread despair in the system. Not only are they denying the vast number of people who are parole eligible, they're not following their own recommendations from the institutional parole officers in more than half of the cases, and they are instituting maximum set-offs, which means the parole board has discretion when they deny parole to set the next parole date at a certain date. And in the majority of cases, they are setting people off 5 years, which is essentially giving them another prison sentence. Even people that are in minimum security work release and work centers who really aren't supposed to be housed in facilities at that classification level unless they're within 3 years of their parole date. So they're being categorically denied and set off 5 years. And this is creating a real crisis in our facilities. It's shut the one reliable mechanism for getting people out. And it's created this massive backlog in our minimum security facilities. The bottom line, it's an adversarial punitive system that has removed hope from people in the system that I believe is contributing to the uptick in violence. And it doesn't serve the people in prison. And really, the overall framework for our system, which is a punishment-based adversarial system, at the end of the day, also does not serve victims, because there is no restorative justice in just keeping everybody locked up until they die and continuing to feed into this adversarial environment where victims are on one side and defendants are on the other, and there's nobody to to bridge them and to provide communication, restoration, forgiveness, redemption. We have a lot of work to do in that area. So on that note, I wish it was more hopeful, but that's kind of where the parole situation is. I'll turn it back over to Stef if we want to open it up to questions.
Thank you so much for that, Beth. And I know that it's not the most positive note to end on necessarily, but it is the most honest. So I really appreciate that. Dillon, if you can just, before we jump right into the good questions that we have about 5 questions, if you can just share really quickly about, with all this information we've given folks, what we want them to do with it. And of course, they can always holler later to ask deeper questions, but if you can go over these.
Absolutely. Well, of course, you can find this report and all of Beth's reporting on the Smart Justice work at alabamasmartjustice.org. It's right there on your screen. So please visit that, check it out. It's really, it's been phenomenal working with Beth, of course, and really so much of her reporting certainly was a bedrock for the Statehouse-to-Prison report as well, because it only underscored again kind of the indifference that we were seeing from the legislature, as so much of the media, including Beth and so many others, have been detailing for us for years, and again the Department of Justice has even. Of course, we want you to contact your lawmakers. I know you hear that ad nauseum from folks like me, but the truth is that they do get those calls. They do oftentimes even take them. And I think that more than anything, that this report should be something to start a conversation about. I'm very aware. I spend, time during the session in the State House and frequently in conversation with lawmakers. I'm very aware that there's a long way to go in shifting attitudes about how we deal with crime and safety in the state of Alabama. But this report is really supposed to underscore what we think are really the principles that should be at the center of those discussions. Beth spent time talking about this as well: rehabilitation and support, actual restorative justice. Those are the things that lawmakers should be shaping criminal justice policy around, and unfortunately is so rooted oftentimes in punishment as a deterrent, and it's simply failed policy. It hasn't worked, and it's not going to suddenly start working. And so this report should really drive some conversations, which I guarantee will be very interesting with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. And you can share it with more than those individuals. Share it with your family members, share it with your friends and elected officials who may be more at the community and local level, because they all need to be thinking about this. At the ACLU, we've also had the pleasure of working with the Communities Not Prisons Coalition, which is made up of a wide array of organizations statewide and includes directly impacted individuals, people who have been directly affected by the criminal punishment system by way of being incarcerated themselves, or a close family member who is or has been. They have been doing incredibly critical work to obstruct plans today to construct new prisons in Alabama. And again, we named this earlier in the discussion, but it simply is not going to be a solution to addressing meaningfully what we need to reorient our system, but to also move us towards a safer community in Alabama, safer communities in Alabama. And so we're really proud of their work and proud to be still working with them. And so I encourage you to follow them on all platforms at Comms Not Prisons.
Thank you so much, Dillon. So we'll jump into these questions. I know we're a little over time, but we also started a bit late, so hopefully we can get to them. So this first one I think is probably directed more at Beth, but folks want to know how the relationship between the parole board and ADOC proper, what has happened to that relationship as a result of these serial denials. Since ADOC obviously has to sort of bear the burden of this parole stoppage, what has that dynamic been like?
Well, I think publicly there's been this kind of named cooperation and new willingness to work together between the Bureau Director Cam Ward and ADOC Commissioner Jeff Dunn. They've made several public statements and released, I think, some op-eds and appeared on television together talking about how there's this new partnership between the two agencies. What I hear from rank and file ADOC employees is they are completely aghast at what is happening with the parole board. I'm actually not just hearing that from ADOC employees. I've heard it from people in district attorneys' offices. I've heard it from police officers. Everybody knows that the parole system has gone completely off the rails. I think what I'm hearing from, the folks that are incarcerated that are being denied is they tell me stories about prison psychologists, checking on them and telling them that they're sorry. Classification officers consoling them and saying, this is not right. I can't believe that you got denied. Correctional officers really just shaking their heads saying, what is going on? And I have heard for years from people that work for ADOC that they feel like the agency should have more of a say in who makes parole. Now, I'll be the first person to say that ADOC is wildly dysfunctional, and I would hesitate to give them any more responsibility for anything. But I do think that the rank and file employees have have the exposure to the incarcerated population, so they know who's ready to go and who is not. They know who's done the work, who has a plan in place. And the parole board really is just looking at folks on paper and making categorical decisions. So I think publicly, there seems to be a willingness for the two agencies to work together, but privately and behind the scenes, it's a totally different story.
Thank you so much, Beth. This next question, and either folks of you can answer it, but I think Dillon, you spoke to the DOJ lawsuit at the beginning, or just the DOJ investigation and takeover, but folks wanted to know, why is there slow progression from the DOJ's part, considering how there is mass death and violence in our prisons currently? And we're not asking you necessarily to be a mind reader, but if you have any thoughts or speculations around why this is happening.
This is a great question. I think it's something we are all asking, right? It is true that the lawsuit was, of course, filed under the previous presidential administration and was inherited by the Biden administration. And I do not know yet what the, what's the word I'm looking for? Perhaps, I don't know what the pace will be for the administration in picking up on, litigation that was filed under the previous Department of Justice leadership, or, what, frankly, their attitude will be also towards mitigating, prison issues that are, frankly, complex and are all over the country right now. But we are waiting and expecting that the DOJ will the lawsuit isn't going to disappear. And we are expecting that the DOJ under the Biden administration will still take it up and move forward. There, of course, are changes within any administration, new U.S. attorneys who are put in place. All of those things, as I understand it, are still, taking place. And so it's hard to say right now, but it is true that this is urgent, which is, again, why we have, pushed for the legislature. This should not take DOJ going any further than they already have. It's the legislature's urgent responsibility to do something right now. And frankly, they have passed the buck too many times. And I don't think that any of the legislature would like for federal intervention to take place. And so it does leave us with the question of, will DOJ act first, or will the legislature finally get its act together and do what they need to do for the sake of their own constituents, which do in fact include people who are incarcerated?
Thank you so much. And you may have already answered this a little bit, but maybe both of you can jump in. One of these other questions is already building off what you just shared, which is like the research and the knowledge that you all are bringing to the institution that is the legislator. Like, how is our Senate and our House responding to this information, to the data, to the research? What are they doing with it? Dillon, you spoke to like there's inaction. So you're bringing this narrative, these stories, all of everything that you all just presented. What are our lawmakers doing with it?
Well, I'll say this, and I'd love to hear Beth's thoughts on this too. We have, I think, all sat through meetings in the State House with, people who come and provide incredible data, really insightful information regarding the status of the population in ADLC facilities, the status of paroles and pardons, the demographic information that much of what we've talked about tonight, and they haven't budged, not nearly enough. The only thing that seems to really be changing are the dynamics around them. And I do think, again, that includes the litigation from the Department of Justice, but it also has to, and I just really want to underscore this, it has to also be hand in hand with the power and the grassroots movement on the ground. We saw how powerful that could be in recent months with the Communities Not Prisons Coalition organizing to obstruct Governor Ivey's previous prison proposal. By no means is that out of the way. By no means are we no longer talking about prison construction, but there was a formal plan that was in motion, and they were able to organize and bring action to prevent it from going any further. And I think that no matter what federal intervention they're facing, it will be up to us as people in the state, as citizens, as their constituents, to continue to make noise and to bring the power that we really all hold to the legislature and remind them that they work for us. And so I think that that will be what ultimately will move them, I'm hoping. What do you think, Beth?
I would just add, I think, Dillon, you probably have a lot more direct contact with lawmakers than I do. If I call, they usually don't want to talk to me because they know I'm going to ask them a bunch of questions and write about them. If I could get just meta for a minute, I think that part of the problem in Alabama is we have a structure of leadership that does not reflect the people that are most impacted by our criminal punishment system. And so you have people that are largely white, privileged, and have absolutely no contact with marginalized communities. And they are writing policy that does not impact them or their families or their communities. And as long as we have a power structure that looks like that, then we will have indifference to this issue. And so we've got to change the people that represent us, because this system has been in crisis since it began. We've never, ever run a humane or constitutional prison system. No, I'm serious. We really have not, ever. I think that a huge reason behind that is because of the politics and the people that are writing the policies and making the decisions that impact this system have no connection to it. It's an abstract.
Thank you so much, Beth. This last question, just so that we can wrap it up, I'm sort of combining the two. Folks have asked a little bit about how sentencing reform plays a role in this work around prison construction, but similarly, like up above that, in the chat, folks asked about pipeline bills that were introduced. So if we could just talk a little bit more specifically about what does the sentencing reform bills look like, and also some of these pipeline bills.
Hey, Dillon, I can go just real quick and then I'll let you get into the specifics.
Please, yeah, sure.
But I would say, just to be clear, none of us are okay with prison conditions. The prisons are horrible, and we know they're horrible, but we don't think the state needs to build more to fix the prison conditions. The problem is there's too many people in the prisons and they're there for too long. And we think that the answer to our prison crisis is policy and sentencing reform. And then they can renovate and rehabilitate the existing facilities to make the conditions better and to reduce suffering. But you absolutely cannot solve this without sentencing reform. Our criminal sentencing structure is the reason that we're in this situation, and sentencing reform should be number one on their list, not an afterthought like it has been.
I think Beth really nailed it. I mean, sentencing reform is going to be one of the key tools to move us towards a vision or of reality where one day we aren't talking about Alabama's prison facilities or Alabama's Department of Corrections as these, unconstitutional actors, as, people who are frankly, as a system that's frankly bringing so much more devastation than it is bringing opportunity or second chances to people. We talked about HB 107 earlier, which is really one of those, I think, key reforms. But if we take a look at, even the amount of things in Alabama that are overclassified really as violent sentences or violent crimes, I should say, right? Like there's such an attitude here among our legislature of, the more that we tell the public that people who have committed a crime are bad and not redeemable, then, that is a badge that they have to carry forever. Sentencing reform allows us to move towards a position where people do not assume that they are that terrible person that they've been made out to be, and that they are in fact worthy of another chance, that they should in fact be able to return to their communities and return to communities, frankly, with the supports that they also need to go on and continue to be successful. And so I really think that's one of the reasons we underscore sentencing reform so much. And I'll just put that in contrast. I know there was a question earlier about pipeline bills and even about Democrats' role in filing pipeline bills, right? Some of those bills I think are around very sensitive topics, things dealing with human trafficking, right? Dealing with the bail schedule for murder. I mean, those are some of the Democratic bills that are in the pipeline. Those are not the same, I recognize, as criminalizing trans healthcare for children, right? But what it again does underscore is that we haven't really, I think, moved towards a position of how we are really addressing the root causes of these problems instead of just piling on criminal penalties in the criminal code, right? And so I think, even though we aren't trying to necessarily draw a direct comparison among all of these things, what we're really just trying to get at here is that there are other ways to move us forward and out of this crisis instead of only continuing to bog us down and dig the hole deeper.
Thank you both so much for all of your shared knowledge and expertise. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Don't forget that you can look at this report, alabamasmartjustice.org. Thank you all so much.